Welcome to Rhyl Riddles, a podcast series looking at the many riddles, myths and mysteries of Rhyl. An audio investigation into Rhyl's unusual history. From the weird and wonderful to the spooky and surreal. Join me as we venture back into Rhyl's past. This episode, the riddle of the mummy in the cupboard.
The Rhyl mummy in the cupboard murder case. Back in 1960, nothing could have prepared taxi driver Leslie Harvey for what he found when he decided to decorate his mother's house as a surprise while she was in hospital. After prizing open a cupboard door at the top of the stairs, he pulled away some old clothes and was horrified to discover the mummified body of a former lodger, who had been locked inside for 20 years. Grandmother Sarah Jane Harvey suddenly went from being a small, sweet-looking 65-year-old to a murder suspect. 35 West Kinmel Street in Rhyl was soon bustling with police, forensic scientists, pathologists, biologists, and the local coroner. Leslie had planned to clean and redecorate his childhood home as a treat. He'd always wondered what was inside the 6'11" high cupboard wardrobe unit on the landing, and was told it contained some leftover items belonging to former wartime tenants. But on May 5, 1960, the 29-year-old recoiled at the grim sight of a wizened human foot beneath thick layers of cobwebs and dust. In a fold of the crumbling blanket around it, a body was revealed. Generations of flies had long ago feasted on the facial features, while moths had destroyed the hair and clothing. Drafts in the 1 3/4 deep cupboard, running from the floor to the loft vent, had produced ideal conditions for mummification. Mrs. Harvey was initially subject to questioning from her sickbed at the nearby Royal Alexandra Hospital, and eventually identified the corpse as former tenant Frances Alice Knight. Mrs. Knight was estranged from her dentist husband, from whom she received a weekly allowance. In her 60s, she was partly crippled and often complained of severe muscular pains after renting a room from Mrs. Harvey during World War II. Mrs. Harvey told police she was unsure of what best to do one particularly bad night in 1940, and went downstairs to make her a cup of tea. When she returned, she said Mrs. Knight was already dead. But instead of telling anyone, she dragged the body into the cupboard and locked it, then falsely obtained her lodger's £2 a week from the post office. Over the years it amounted to £2,099. The soft-featured lady told staff her friend had moved to an old folks' home in Llandudno to see out her twilight years in supervised comfort. But Mrs. Knight's shriveled and hardened body was found some 20 years later in the doubled-up position, dressed in a faded night dress. Surrounded by insect-riddled flypaper, it had become mummified by the warm air that had circulated through the confined space over the decades. Because the body was adhering to the lino on the cupboard floor, a garden spade was used to lever it out before the rigid mummy was then taken to the mortuary while further investigations were undertaken. The story gripped the world's media, who were left fascinated by the riddle of the mummy in the cupboard. Newspaper reports published by the Daily Post and Echo at the time set the scene that faced detectives. One read, "Suspended from a hook inside the cupboard was a flypaper completely covered with flies. Thick cobwebs with dead spiders clung to the interior walls. As the men worked in that confined space with little available light, clouds of thick, choking dust flew up." Another said, "The body was found lying on its back with the legs bent and the chin pressed into the right shoulder. The body was partly covered by blanket material, which was disintegrating into dust. Pathologists had to immerse the body in a bath of glycerine solution for a week until it had softened enough for internal examinations to be carried out. A stocking ligature and a groove around the neck suggested the cause of death was strangulation, and police treated the case as a murder inquiry. At Mrs. Harvey's trial at Rhyl Assizes, the prosecution alleged that shortly after she was given permission to draw Mrs. Knight's money, she strangled her with a stocking. In her defense, she told the court that Mrs. Knight had been suffering with a bad cold, and said it was common knowledge to wrap a stocking around the neck to cure throat ailments. The jury was instructed that the prosecution were in no position to prove that the knotted garment had been stretched. Mrs. Harvey was cleared of murder, but was found guilty of obtaining money by deception between May 1940 and April 1960. She was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment. On her release, she went to live at a nursing home and died soon after of cancer. Leslie Harvey's gruesome discovery and the mystery of Mrs. Knight's unsolved death is still the talk of Ryl's townsfolk.
Welcome to an extra podcast of Rhyl Riddles on the Rhyl Mummy in the Cupboard case. This podcast takes a look at the reporting of the crime in America. The following is an actual American newspaper report from 1960 about the case.
Time, Monday, October 31st, 1960. Nobody relishes a good murder trial more than the British public, and British murderers have responded by exhibiting a gory ingenuity that few practitioners of other nationalities can match. One 1949 classic that gripped all Britain involved a man who did in 9 people over a period of years, pausing each time to sip a wine glass of warm blood before dissolving the body in a vat of sulfuric acid. Another British murderer, convicted in 1953, consummated his frequent love affairs by strangling his partners and hanging their bodies behind the kitchen wall. Last week, newspaper readers hung over every detail of a new thriller that promised to follow the classic tradition. Its setting was the town of Rhyl, seaside resort. There, one rainy day last May, 29-year-old Leslie Harvey decided to clean out an old, locked closet on the upstairs landing in the boarding house on West Kinmel Street owned by his mother, Mrs. Sarah Jane Harvey, 65. She had been under treatment for a cancerous stomach tumor, and he planned to have the house spruced up as a surprise for her when she got back from the hospital. Forcing the bolt of the closet, he opened the door and fell back in horror. Huddled on the floor at his feet, under thick layers of cobwebs and dust, was the shriveled body of a woman, partly covered with a moth-eaten blanket and the decayed remnants of a blue dressing gown. The skull was bare of hair, the eye sockets were hollow, and the skin was parched to the color of dark leather and hard as rock. Beside the body lay an empty bottle of disinfectant. Grooves on the neck. An unidentified mummy clearly was too much for Ryl's local police force, and the call went out for expert help. The Home Office sent pathologist Dr. Gerald Evans and biologist Dr. Alan Clift. Entomologists studied the dead moths and flies found in the closet. Also enlisted was a London University Egyptologist who was a specialist on ancient mummies. For weeks the experts studied their find, unwrapping and comparing a 2,500-year-old mummy from Liverpool University. They measured the shrinkage of the bones to determine that the woman had died 2 decades ago, probably in 1940. Police missing persons files helped establish her identity, a Mrs. Frances Knight, who was last seen in March 1940. Mrs. Knight was then 56 and known to be ailing. Discarding one theory after another, the experts finally were forced to the conclusion that no chemical had been used to induce mummification. Rather, by a freak of chance, Warm air from below the floor, flowing through cracks in the door and out a trapdoor at the top of the closet, had stopped the normal decay of flesh a few days after death. What was the cause of death? Looking close, Dr. Evans spotted traces of fabric embedded in grooves around the neck. It was the remnant of a length of woman's stocking. At its end was a reef knot, twisted tightly. But there were still no clues to the killer or the motive. Then the police traced Mrs. Knight's former husband to a town in Sussex. He had not seen his wife in 24 years, he said, but grumbled that nevertheless he was still paying her £2, $5.60, a week in support money via the clerk of the magistrate's court in Rhyl. Quite right, confirmed the clerk. Since 1940, he had handled $5,877 on her behalf. But he added, for many years the person who had come to pick it up was not the invalid Frances Knight, but her landlady, Sarah Jane Harvey. Almost every week for 20 years, said the clerk. Mrs. Harvey was asked, how is Mrs. Knight? The usual answer, about the same. When the money was late, she protested that Mrs. Knight would play hell, and sometimes at Christmas Mrs. Harvey would say that Mrs. Knight was demanding payment in advance. Last June, Mrs. Harvey was arrested. On trial for her life last week, shriveled Sarah Harvey sat impassively beside her nurse, collapsing into sobs only when her son took the stand. But she stuck to her story that Mrs. Knight had been taken suddenly ill one night and died in agony before she could summon a doctor. In panic, said Mrs. Harvey, she had dragged the corpse into the closet. She had collected the money only because she feared she would be accused of murder if the death were discovered. The prosecution's case hung like a thread on the ligature around the mummy's neck. For 5 hours, Mrs. Harvey's attorney, Andrew Rankin, 36, hammered at the calm, moderate Dr. Evans. Suppose, he asked, that the stocking found around Mrs. Knight's throat had not been stretched. Would the cause of death be certain? No, replied the scientist. Then Rankin moved in on witness Clift, the government biologist who had rashly admitted that he was an expert on stocking strangulation cases. Did you ever ask if that stocking had been stretched? He thundered. With a sigh, Dr. Clift replied that he had not. Had the stocking really looked like a rope, as Clift had testified? Clift paused, then admitted, it was not twisted as a rope is twisted, but it reminded me of rope, snapped Rankin. And you call yourself an expert? With that, Clift fainted dead away on the witness stand. The government's case collapsed with him. After the adjournment, Britain's embarrassed Solicitor General, Sir Jocelyn Simon, rose with the prosecutor's motion that the murder charge be quashed. I agree entirely, said the judge, Mr. Justice Edmund Davies. But Sarah Harvey's troubles were not over, for there was still the fraud charge to be dealt with. It is quite impossible to shut one's eyes to the fact that during the whole intervening period of those charges, you have been obtaining £2 week by week, the judge said sternly to Mrs. Harvey. In effect, you have swindled Mr. Knight of something like £2,000. I sentence you to serve a term of 15 months at Her Majesty's prison.
You have been listening to an episode of Rhyl Riddles, a podcast created, edited, and produced by Glenn Mitchell. Join us again for another journey back into Ryl's past, and more riddles, mysteries, and myths.